All right, today we're going to dive into the absolutely wild story of a single, chaotic manuscript. Seriously, this thing started out as a battlefield on paper, but it ended up becoming a lifeline for millions of people around the world.
So let's start with a number. $1,560,000. That's what a single copy of this manuscript sold for at an auction back in 2004. So you've got to ask yourself, what in the world could make a bunch of messy papers that valuable?
Well, the guy who wrote most of it, Bill Wilson, he didn't call it a masterpiece. He called it mangled. And he was right. It was a total mess of crossed-out sentences, scribbled notes, and some really heated arguments written right in the margins. This wasn't some divinely inspired text. It was a war on paper. And it would eventually become the foundation for the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous.
And that's our big question here, right? How did a book that was born from so much conflict and financial ruin become one of the most influential texts of the entire 20th century? Well, the answer is just an incredible story of failure, compromise, and what you might call accidental genius. So, to get to the bottom of this, we've got to go back to 1937. The co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith, were facing a pretty terrifying reality. It was a time that Bill later called their flying blind period.
I mean, just look at this. After 3 years of trying, the fellowship was just tiny. They had only 2 small meetings, one in Akron and one in New York, and a grand total of about 40 members who had actually managed to stay sober. The failure rate was absolutely enormous, and the whole experiment was right on the verge of totally collapsing.
And you can just feel the desperation in what Bill Wilson said. They'd found something that seemed to work for a few of them, but they were watching countless others die. They just knew that if they couldn't figure out a way to get their message out there beyond just face-to-face meetings, their little movement was just going to die out.
So what do? Well, Bill Wilson, who is this ex-Wall Street guy, he came up with let's call it a grand plan. It had everything: paid missionaries to spread the word, a whole national chain of hospitals for alcoholics, and a book. The book was key. It would act as a meeting in print to standardize their programs so the message couldn't get, as he put it, garbled.
And who do you take a grand plan to? The richest man in America. Of course, John D. Rockefeller Jr. And he was actually impressed. He said he was strangely stirred by it all. But here's where the story takes a wild turn. He got worried that a big pile of cash would professionalize the whole thing and ruin the simple spirit of one drunk helping another. So he turned them down for the big money and gave them just $5,000. Just like that, the missionaries in their hospitals were dead on arrival. Everything was now riding on the book.
So with no other options, the book became the entire project. The problem was agreeing on what to actually put in the book turned into an absolute brawl.
Now, you have to understand, this manuscript we're talking about isn't one clean document. It's more like an archaeological dig. It has at least 5 different layers. You've got the original type draft, then the changes that everyone agreed on, then the changes that got shot down, and then my favorite part, the furious scribbles and arguments in the margins. And they were even making changes at the very last second at the printing press. It's a fossil of a creative war.
And this little scribble in the margin? This is absolutely too groupy. This says everything. See, early AA was really influenced by a religious movement called the Oxford Group, and that first draft was just dripping with its language. This note shows the pushback from the agnostic and atheist members who were like, whoa, this is way too preachy, you're going to scare people away.
And this might be the single most important change they made in the entire book. They systematically went through and changed the tone. The original commanding voice, "You must do this," got softened into a descriptive "we." So a line like, "At some of these you may balk," became, "At some of these we balked." See the difference? It stopped being a list of commands and started being a story of shared experience. It was brilliant.
And then came the phrase that broke the deadlock, the one Bill Wilson called a 10 strike. God as we understood him. This was the hard-won compromise that finally ended the war between the deeply religious members and the atheists. All of a sudden, the spiritual part of the program was open to your own interpretation. It meant anyone of any faith or no faith at all could find their own way in. That one phrase basically unlocked the program for the entire world.
Okay, so the text is finally hammered out. A messy but vital compromise. Huge sigh of relief, right? Well, not so fast, because their problems were far from over. Now they had to actually sell the thing. And this is where the story goes from difficult to, well, a total disaster.
What came next was just a train wreck.
Their big marketing plan with Reader's Digest? It fell through. A desperate last-ditch postcard campaign that they spent their last $500 on? It resulted in exactly 2 book orders. 2. Soon, their little publishing company was bankrupt, and Bill Wilson, well, he literally had his furniture put out on the street when his house was foreclosed on.
You heard it from the man himself, stony broke. This wasn't just a little setback, it was complete and total failure. The book was printed, sure, but the movement was broke and its founder was homeless. I mean, by all accounts, this should have been the end of the story. Game over.
So if Rockefeller didn't fund it, who did? Who actually paid for this book? Well, it wasn't some big philanthropist. It was the early members themselves, a bunch of drunks who bought stock in a book that hadn't even been written yet. And the whole thing was saved at the very last minute by a $1,000 loan from a guy named Bert Taylor, who had to put his own struggling business up as collateral to do it.
And yet, somehow, against all of those odds, on this date, April 10th, 1939, the first edition of Alcoholics Anonymous was published. It landed in a world that had no idea it was coming, with zero marketing, no money, and a group of founders who were completely broke.
So after all that chaos, all that failure and desperation, what's the big takeaway here? What's the lesson from this incredible story of creation?
I think the first thing is this. The Big Book's power doesn't come from being perfect. It wasn't some sacred text delivered from a mountaintop. It was a human document, hammered out by flawed, desperate people arguing in a room. Its authority comes from those messy, authentic human origins.
And just think about that. From being stony broke and homeless to this, over 27 million copies sold in the US and Canada alone. It's been translated into dozens and dozens of languages. It's a level of success that was just completely unimaginable back in 1939.
And that's really the heart of it, isn't it? The book's greatest strengths were born directly from its biggest fights. That shift from you to we is what makes it so welcoming. The huge compromise on God as we understood him is what made it universally accessible. And because the skeptics had just as much say as the believers, the final text feels honest. The book works because of its difficult birth, not in spite of it.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to chew on. The story of the Big Book makes you wonder, maybe real innovation isn't about having a flawless plan from day one. Maybe the most powerful ideas are the ones that are tested by doubt, that are forged in compromise, and that somehow manage to survive their own near-death experiences. Maybe the greatest things really do begin as a mangled mess.